everybody, this is Liz with Connecting Threads. I am so excited because today I get to show you how to make the Churn Dash block. Now, the block that we're going to be making today is this one right here, which is made out of faux tweed. And it is a very simple and traditional block, but as you can see, just by changing color, print, and tone, you can create wildly different blocks. Now, the formula for these is extremely simple, and we'll go over that in a little bit, but I wanted to show you some of the variations that we have that I asked our Connecting Threads staff to make. And there are so many different options here. So this top row right here, these are going to be your classic two-tone Churn Dash blocks. So this one right here, this block is a teal background with a bright, beautiful, bold floral in the foreground. It's a really simple block, but it's really powerful. These two here, which were sewn by our director of merchandising, she ended up taking the same formula, but she kind of flipped it on its head. So she did one with the light background and one with the dark background. I think it's a really fun way to play with the formula and create blocks that pair really beautifully together. Now this bottom row here, this is how I asked my Connecting Threads staff to take these blocks and do something absolutely wild with them, which they definitely did. So this first block, it takes the basic formula, and what she did is she added a different color for the center here, which I think is really nice. It adds an extra pop of color, which I think is great, especially on a black background. Now this one here I think is our most wild block. I think it's really fun. She ended up taking different colors for the background sections here. So she created an entirely different shape just by changing where the fabric lands, which I think is really exciting. So this block looks the least like a Churn Dash, but it's still using the exact same formula. Now, the other two, I think this is really cool that I ended up asking our Connecting Threads staff to make different blocks. Two different people ended up using some leftover striping from other projects to create their Churn Dash blocks. This one is going to be a simple formula, just like these up here. It's one color for the background and then striping for the foreground. This one takes the same formula and just adds an extra pop of color right here in the center. So each one of these blocks uses the Churn Dash formula, but creates an entirely different block. So let's go ahead and jump in and I'll tell you all about how to sew the different components of your own Churn Dash. Your Churn Dash block is made up of three main components here. And you'll see I have a gridded version that is blank, so it's really easy to see those different components. And then I have a printed version of the one that we're going to be sewing today. Now our finished block is going to be 12 inches by 12 inches in its finished sewn in side. And it's separated into 3 rows or columns, and all of the different components end up being the exact same cut size. So this block is, if anybody didn't believe me that this block was simple, it is really, really simple. So let's go over each one of the components. We have our half square triangles in the corner. We have our center square right here in the middle. And then we have these little half square blocks that are made up of 2 rectangles. And I'm going to be calling these the little sashing blocks because that's what this is. This is this cute little sashing that goes in between each one of your corners. Now to figure out the size of each one of these components, we have our finished block size, which will be 12 inches. And because these 3 columns are exactly the same size, that means all we have to do is divide 12 by 3. So that means that each one of these components needs to measure 4 inches by 4 inches in its sewn in size. Now, this is going to be the sewn in size, but remember, we have to cut all of these as well. So each one of these components needs to be cut to 4.5 by 4.5. That means that we get a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side. Now, each one of these components, because we don't have to worry about the fact that they're all the same size, it makes it very easy for this block to be sewn, which is really, really great. But we are going to go over how to cut each one of these sections because half square triangles and these little sashing sections, these require a little bit of extra math to make sure that you get the correct size. Let's go ahead and go over how to cut all of these pieces. So we have our block picture right here so that I can explain how each of these components will be cut out. First, we have our center square. So remember, 12 divided by 3 is 4. So the finished cut size will need to be a 1/4 inch seam allowance added to that finished sewn in size. So 4 by 4 inches plus a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side. That means this needs to be 4.5 by 4.5. You only need to cut one of your center square. Now, the next component will be these little stashing blocks, these little half square blocks that have the background and then this little stashing right here. These need to be 2.5 by 4.5. So remember, the 4.5 length is exactly like your center square. You're adding a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side. But we also need to take these 2-inch sections and sew them together. So we need the seam allowance here in the middle, and then we need the seam allowance on the top and the bottom. 4 divided by 2 is 2, and then we'll add our 1/4 inch seam allowance, 2.5. So you're going to need 4 of your background in that yellow color, and then you'll need 4 of the bright green in leprechaun. So we've got those right here. These will be sewn together to create those little half square rectangular blocks. Now the last portion will be our half square triangles. And this is the part that I know can be a little confusing for people that are new to half square triangles. We are going to be doing the 2 at a time method. And what that means is we're going to create both of these blocks at the same time. It's a really easy method, and it's really great, especially as far as accuracy goes. It adds just a little bit to the edge so you can trim your block down so that it is the perfect size. So we need to sew these 2 together and these 2 together, and I'll show you how to do that. So what you're gonna need is you're going to need 2 squares in this dark green and 2 squares in your yellow that measure 5 by 5 inches. That extra little bit is for us to sew both of those at the same time and make sure we have the seam allowance on each side of our half square triangle. We have our 2 dark blocks, and then we have our 2 yellow blocks. Let me go ahead and walk you through how to sew your half square triangles. Creating these half square triangles, we're gonna start out by taking the lighter of the 2 fabrics because we're gonna be drawing a guideline on it. Now, I have these Freon gel pens. I really like these because they go away when you iron on top of them, so I love them for this, but also this will not show in your finished product. So if you don't have one of these, you can even use a ballpoint pen because the guideline we're gonna be drawing is going to be cut down the middle, and it's going to be a seam allowance, so you won't see it in your finished piece. Now, we're gonna take the lighter of our 2 fabrics, we're gonna take it right here, and we're going to have it point to point along the diagonal. We're gonna take a ruler, and we're going to line it up from those 2 diagonal points, take our pen, and we're going to draw our guideline here. We'll take this. I'm using a bright purple pen, so it's really easy to see. I highly recommend that you use something that you can see here because this guideline is where we're going to be placing the edge of our presser foot, and so it's really helpful to make sure that you can see it. If you're using dark on dark fabrics, so this is pretty dark, the purple does show up on this fabric, but it is quite a bit lighter. And so if you want something on a dark, like if you're using black, you can always use a chalk pen here. So sometimes that can be really helpful. But since we're using this nice bright yellow, this purple line shows up great. We're gonna go ahead and put those to the side. We're gonna take this yellow block, right sides together with our dark green, and we're gonna place it right on top. Now we are going to be sewing along the 2 sides of your guideline. So eventually this is where we're gonna cut and turn this into 2 half square triangles. See, super easy. We're gonna pin along this line, and then we're gonna take it over to the sewing machine, and I'll show you where to sew it. So let's go ahead and get this pinned. And now we're ready to go. So we've created our guideline down the center diagonal of our square, and what we're gonna be doing is we're not sewing on the guideline that we drew in purple here. We are sewing a 1/4 inch to the right and to the left of that line. So you will have 2 sewn lines, and then you will have your center guideline that you drew down the middle. Let's go ahead and start. We're gonna sew on the right-hand side first. We're gonna flip it, and then we'll sew on the left-hand side. So we'll get this all ready. Don't forget to take your pins out as you go. All right, so we've created our first line here. We've turned our block around, and let's do the next 1/4 inch seam line right here. So again, you should have 2 sewn lines, and then your middle guideline should be right in between them. And there we go. So now we're gonna take this over to our cutting mat, and we're gonna cut down the middle, and you will have 2 half square triangle blocks. Now that we've sewn our half square triangle, we have our 2 sewn lines that are 1/4 inch away from that center guideline that we drew. So now we need to cut this into our 2 half square triangles. So we'll take our ruler and our rotary cutter. Let's line this up with that center line, and we'll go ahead and slice this guy in half. Now, once we have them separated here, you can open them up and you can see that you've got your half square triangles. Now, you might be really excited and ready to go, but we still have a couple of steps that we need to do to finish these off. When you do the 2 at a time method, after we press, we're going to need to trim them down with another ruler. One of the reasons why I think this method is so great is because you have the grace of being able to trim them down. When I do the 1 at a time method, I almost always end up creating them just a little wonky. And so I think it's really helpful to do 2 at a time. So let's go ahead and press this one here, and I'll show you how to cut it. So we'll take it over to our pressing table. I'm gonna open up this seam, and I like to open these seams completely instead of pressing them in one direction. This is really helpful to reduce the bulk for this block. So sometimes you can always press your half square triangles with the seam facing towards the darkest fabric, but for this block, I have found that opening the seam is the best way to reduce bulk here. We've got our block pressed. Now we need to trim it down. Now, this is where one of my favorite rulers comes in handy. This is a 4.5 by 4.5 inch ruler from Olfa, and it has a diagonal line down the center. This 45-degree diagonal line is very important because we will line it up with the diagonal of our half square triangle. So this makes sure that that diagonal line is perfectly centered. If you have any size ruler, it can be bigger than the 4.5 by 4.5. I just think it fits so perfectly with this project. But if you have a larger ruler, as long as it has this diagonal line down the center to really help guide you, that's all you need. Now, what we're going to do is we're just gonna trim off a little excess. Now, when I hold it over, you might notice that there is a very minimal amount of excess around each side. This is a pretty tight method for creating 2 at a time. It's okay if you fudge up just a little bit, you're gonna be just fine. But that little edge, this is what we're gonna be trimming off. So we're gonna go ahead and get this nice and centered. I'm gonna take my rotary cutter and I'm gonna cut off one side, and then I'm also gonna cut off the top here. So go ahead and close up our rotary cutter. Let's get those little seams out of the way here. And now we have this beautiful corner here with 2 straight lines. So we'll flip it, take our ruler, and because this is 4.5 by 4.5, all I have to do is line up the edge of the ruler with the 2 lines that I just cut. So you don't have to have this perfectly sized ruler, but for this project, it was just so perfect and it made this cutting so much easier. We're gonna make sure that that lines up with the edges for our 4.5 by 4.5 finished block. Cut the side and cut the top. We'll go ahead and take those seams out of the way. And now we have a perfect 4.5 by 4.5 inch half square triangle. So what we're gonna do is we're going to press the seam of this one here, do the exact same thing. We're gonna cut it down to size, and then we're gonna take our other 2 squares, and you'll notice that we can create that diagonal line right here. So just like our other one, we're gonna draw right down the center. We're going to take 2 sides, place them together, take it over to our sewing machine, and repeat this whole process. So at the end, you will have 4 half square triangles for the corner of your block. The next component that we need to create are those little half rectangle squares. So we're going to take one of our 2.5 by 4.5 rectangles and one of our bright green rectangles, right sides together, and you are going to sew along the longest side here. So I'm gonna take my pins. These blocks are very easy to create. So we'll go ahead and pin this, but if you would like to chain piece these, you can prep all of these pieces at one time and then push them all through the sewing machine, one right after the other. So these are very simple to create. There's not much mystery to them. So go ahead and take this over to our sewing machine. Now we have our two rectangles right sides together here at the sewing machine. We're gonna sew 1/4 inch along this long 4.5 inch side, and then we'll be ready to go. So let's take this over to our sewing machine, line up that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Don't forget to take your pins out as you go. And there we go. We have our first half square block here. Now you've got your sashing on this side and your background on this side. If you want to, you can take all of these pieces and chain piece them one right after the other. It's gonna save you a lot of time by doing these all in one row. So take the other 3 that you need to create and slide them through the sewing machine. So now that you've sewn your 2 rectangles together, you open it up and you can see you've got your little sashing right here and then your background. We're going to press this seam open. We'll take it over to our pressing mat, lightly push it open here, and then I'm going to press down across the entire seam. Flip it over. I like to press another time here just to make sure it's nice and flat. And now you should have all 3 of your components finished. Your center square, half square triangles, and then these little sashing blocks that are the little half square rectangular blocks. So let's go ahead and lay this out, and then we'll start prepping for our row sewing. So we have our center square, move our corners. I'm gonna take my little half rectangle blocks and let's go ahead and just line those up first. So we'll get those where the bright green is right up against the center square. It already looks really great. And now we will take our corner squares and we will line them right up. So the green should be facing inside and then your yellow should be facing towards the corner of the block. So we'll take all of these, get them right into place. And now you can see that you've got your churn dash. You're ready to actually start sewing this whole thing together. So once you finish the components, you finally get to see what this block is gonna look like. And that's like the best part of this whole process, is when you realize that you are like just a couple steps away from finishing. Now, for this block, sewing all of these little components together, what I like to do is sew a row, and a row. So we'll start with our top row, go to our middle row, and then we'll finish with our bottom row. Now you can chain piece these as you go. It is totally up to you. Sometimes, especially if you're newer to sewing quilt blocks, take it one step at a time. So we're gonna take our corner square, flip it right sides together, and because we laid this out, you know exactly where you're going to end up sewing. I'm gonna take these 2 blocks and make sure they're nice and ready to go. Line them up, and then we will sew along this seam line. This whole process can take a little getting used to. That is one of the reasons why I recommend for beginners to go one at a time, because sometimes you can screw up and that's totally okay, but seam ripping is really annoying. We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna sew these 2 together. Now, the other thing that I wanna mention is when you're sewing blocks together, remember that as you're sewing here, these seams, some of the seam allowances that we pressed open are going to be facing the needle and the sewing foot. And what can happen is your little sewing foot can end up pushing up a seam. And you don't want that to happen. We worked really hard to make sure that we pressed these seams open here. And so you wanna make sure that those end up sitting down. So one of the ways that you can do that is by making sure that you have as few seams as possible facing the sewing machine. So what I like to do is I take this block, so we're gonna be sewing along this line right here. I like to take this block and flip it over. Now what that's going to do is that means that this seam right here, which is the corner of your half square triangle, that is going to be facing the sewing machine. We're going to be sewing a seam down this way at 1/4 inch. And so the only seam that we have to worry about is this little one right here. Always make sure that you take your pins and you pin down your seam allowance. This will help make sure that this seam, which is facing your sewing machine, doesn't end up getting flipped up by your foot. Now we'll still go nice and slow over these seams, but it is a really good rule of thumb to make sure that any seam facing your sewing machine is pinned down. Go ahead and take this over to the sewing machine and we'll sew this up. So here at the sewing machine, we're going to sew our 1/4 inch seam line. Don't forget that you've got a seam facing towards the needle. So it's really helpful to have a pin right there to make sure that this seam stays down. And then don't forget to take your pins out as you go. So let's go ahead and just line that right up. I always go nice and slow with these seams to make sure that it stays down as it hits my sewing machine foot. So I'll take this pin out and then just keep an eye on that seam, making sure that it stays down. I'll sew right over it. And now we have our half square triangle with the little dash right here. So all we're gonna do next is we're gonna take our other half square triangle and we're gonna place it right here. You don't even need to go and take this over to press this seam down. I like to sew both blocks to the side of this block right here. So both half square triangles, I like to sew this one and the other one on, and then I'll go and press down my seams. It just helps make the process go quite a bit faster. So we'll go ahead and lay our next block down and sew it again. Now that you've sewn your 2 blocks together here, the next thing that you're going to do is you're gonna sew on the next half square triangle here. Now, you don't need to press this seam just yet. It's really easy to do this very quick chain sewing process. This seam, we can press it a little bit later. We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna take our half square triangle, we're gonna flip it right sides together, just like we did before. Always make sure that you pin down whichever seams will be facing the needle or the sewing machine. And if it's easier for you, you can flip it one way or the other. Don't forget to check for seams on the back side. So any seam, front or back, facing the sewing machine needs to be pressed down. Now, this same process for this top row is exactly what you're going to use for each one of these rows. You're gonna start from the left, flip it, right sides together, 1/4 inch seam allowance. Half square triangle, flip it, right sides together, 1/4 inch seam allowance right here. So each one of these rows should come together very quickly. So we'll take this over to the sewing machine, and then from here, we should end up with a series of complete rows that you have sewn together. After each one of these 1/4 inch seam allowances, you'll take it back over here, and then take your far right block, flip, right sides together, 1/4 inch seam allowance. Same with the bottom row. So at the end of this, we're gonna end up with 3 finished rows. Now you should have 3 rows. You've got your half square triangle rows, and then you have your center row right here. Now, I'm not gonna make you watch me press every single seam, but this is when we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna press all of our seams. Now, I highly recommend that you take these and you press them all open. You'll notice that we have bulky seams on both sides. There's really no winning here. You're gonna end up with a little bulk on one side or the other. So by pressing them open, I feel like it really evens out the bulk. Same goes for your center section here. You're gonna flip it over, and it's easier to just press these seams open. I'm gonna go ahead and breeze through the pressing section, and then we'll go ahead and move on to how to sew these rows together. Now we are going to be sewing our pressed rows together. Now this top row, we're gonna be sewing it to our middle row, and it'll be right sides together. But before I show you that, first I wanna talk to you a little bit about pinning. Now, because these are all evenly sized blocks, you should have the edge of this green sashing right here matching up with the edge of your half square triangle. So this bright green should match up with this dark green right up here. The same goes for the right-hand side. So you'll see these 2 seams, they should all end up matching up. And so one of the ways that we can make sure that that happens is by pinning properly. Flipping it over, you're gonna be sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance along this edge right here, but we are going to make sure that we pin at the intersections of our seams. We have 2 open seams right here, and we want to make sure that we pin at the seam allowance that is facing the sewing machine. So we're going to be sewing from the left-hand side here to the right-hand side. So we need to make sure that any seam facing this way is pinned down. Start by making sure that these little seams right here that connect the half square triangle and your sashing, those are pinned down. And always make sure that they line up with the back seam here, because you've got the seam on the back and you've got the seam on the front. So these seam allowances should match up, and then we'll pin them down together. So it'll go through quite a few layers of fabric here. Now we're gonna do the same for this seam here. We're gonna make sure that those seams are lined up. We're gonna take our pin and we're going to pin through that seam allowance. Now, there are a couple of hidden seams that are facing our sewing needle. If you flip it over, you'll see that the edges of this sashing will also be facing the sewing machine. We're gonna go ahead and just make sure that these are nice and tidy. Make sure the edges of our blocks are lined up. And then I'm gonna take a pin and I'm going to pin in the front side, making sure that I catch that little seam allowance. So I'll show you on the back. When you flip it over, you'll see that I was able to take that needle and catch the seam allowance. So again, any seam facing your needle, you wanna make sure that you pin down. So we'll go ahead and do the right-hand side here. And now we are ready to take this over to the sewing machine. So now that we've got our 2 rows together, right sides together, we've got our pins in place where the seam allowances are. Now, I have these block seams right here matching up, and we've got the seams that are facing the needle down with those pins. Now, don't forget, these kind of look like there's nothing going on here. When you flip the block over, we are making sure that the seam that is facing the sewing foot is down even on the back side. Those can sometimes get tripped up, so always make sure that you have all seam allowances facing your foot pinned down. We'll go ahead and take this to the sewing machine and sew our 1/4 inch seam allowance. And now we have our top 2 rows sewn together. And you'll notice because we pinned where those seams match, your block lines here should match up pretty well. So that is a really nice crisp corner, and that comes from making sure that you're pinning in the right spots. So let's take this over and press it, and then all we have to do is sew on our bottom row. We've got our 2 rows sewn together here. So when I open this up, you'll see that we've got the top part of our churn dash now attached to our center part. We are going to do the exact same thing that we did before. We don't need to press this just yet, and we can go ahead and sew this right here. So we're gonna flip our bottom row up, 1/4 inch seam allowance right here. Make sure that you pin anything that is going to be facing the sewing machine. Now, remember, most of the time your seam allowance is going to be facing to the right. I turned this around a little bit so it's easier for you to see the seams that are gonna be facing the sewing machine. So we've got that little secret one in the back, we've got these 2 right here, and then we have another little secret one in the back. So we'll go ahead and pin this down, take this over to the sewing machine, and then I'll give you the last pressing tip before you're done with your finished block. Now you should have all 3 of your rows sewn together. So we definitely have a finished block here, but we need to press it. Now, just like we've done with all of the other seams, I really recommend that you press your seams open here. There's a lot of bulk, and so pressing to one side or the other can get a little tough. So these seams will all be pressed open. So just take it over to your pressing board. Just like we've done in the past, you can push it open just a little bit and then take your iron and make sure that you're not wiggling it around too much. Remember, an iron is a pressing tool. So I like to lift up and then press down. Sometimes a little wiggle is helpful. lift up, press down. Lift up, press down, and we'll go through the entire block this way. Go ahead and pull this down just a smidge. Let's go ahead and press that down. Open that up and press that down. This can take a couple minutes. Take your time. You always want to make sure that you press well. And remember that after you're done pressing them back, it is very helpful to go to the front, make sure that it's pressed well, and then press it down on the front too. So this just kind of reinforces your seams in the back here. I always like to make sure that I do that. So you do that for the other side of your block, and you will have a finished Churn Dash. And congratulations, you finished your Churn Dash block. As you can see, it is a very simple formula to make this block, and you will be cruising through making so many of these. I can't wait to see what you do with your Churn Dash, so don't forget to tag us on social media so that we can see your finished creations. Imagine confetti, but fabric. It'll be so terrible to clean up.